Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at this mainline unrebuilt Royal Scot that's been sent to me by Mick, who said that it's stopped running, so we're going to have a look. Getting it out of the box, it becomes apparent that the body is loose from the chassis and there are several detail parts floating around in the box, namely the sandboxes off the body shell and also the two fixing screws. The tender there doesn't look to be in too bad a condition. There's one of the sandboxes. So we're going to have a look at this and see if we can get it running. Now, I put it on the track to do a battery test, and there was no life in this model whatsoever. It was not even humming. There was no power getting to the motor at all. So I'll just remove the body shell there. So I'm loath to touch this because if you touch both halves of a split chassis Loco, you can get an electric shock off it. So I just jacked the model up and then using a cable on the battery, even putting power direct to the brushes, produced no life whatsoever. So I'm going to have to take this model apart and see what's wrong with it. And I start by removing the base keeper plate by removing these two screws here. I will say the weathering job on this model is absolutely fantastic. I really do like the look of this model. It's having this weathered really does show the amount of detail and how nice these mainline locomotives were for their time. So I'm just removing the two screws that hold the base keeper plate in place. Lifts off from the rear. It comes away, taking the front bogie with it. I can see that luckily on this model the axles have not split. So just gently prising the cylinders off the castings there. I can remove the wheel sets and side rods as one. But unusually for this model, the centre wheel set appears to be stuck in. It won't come out as easy as it should. So I'm not sure if that's a problem with the die-cast chassis or what. But eventually, after much persuasion and leverage with this screwdriver, the middle wheel set eventually comes free and I can remove all the wheel sets and side rods as one, like I said. This really was stubborn and really didn't want to come out of the chassis plate there. So I'm having to put some force into this to get it down. When it does come out, I have a quick look. It's not expanded or anything. It must just be an error with the die casting of the chassis plates. So now to split the two halves of the chassis, you have to remove 4 screws, 2 on this side and 2 on the other side. And with these removed, there are 3 black screws and then a silver screw that goes through where the brush plate is in the top right hand corner of the model there. And then the 2 chassis halves will come apart. And you will see when they're apart there is a fibre cardboard insulating piece and 2 plastic insulators at the bottom there. The 2 gears that form the drivetrain also come away. There's a lot of old lubrication in the model. It's relatively sticky where the old oil has congealed over the years. So I'm going to now remove these 2 screws to remove the brushes and springs and give me access to the commutator to see what we're dealing with. And it is quite dirty. There's a lot of carbon buildup on the inside of that motor faceplate there. Although the brushes themselves don't look to be in too bad condition. So I'm just going to put that down and I'm going to give this a clean with a cotton bud and meths and you will see just how dirty this cotton bud gets. Look at that, look, that's all carbon buildup from use, that's wear off the brushes. So cleaning that up, I'll remove all that and then I can remove the brush plate retainers there, trying not to lose the springs. There's one of them. And it looks like the springs are quite compressed, so that may be a reason why this isn't working. So removing everything there just to make sure everything's out, everything will need cleaning. There's one of the springs. And then I can gently take the brushes away. And then as I was saying, the armature lifts out of the magnet in its entirety. Checking the coils over, the coils look okay. It doesn't look like it's burnt out or anything. So I'm going to clean the commutator faceplate with my tried and trusted method of cotton bud and methylated spirits to clean the worst off. Then going to polish up the brass plates gently using my fiberglass pencil because there was some hardened carbon on the plates there. And then I'm going to clean out the gaps between the plates with a cocktail stick, just to make sure everything's nice and clean and as it should be. Cleaning the inside of the motor housing, that is also extremely dirty with a lot of carbon buildup. So again, this was all cleaned out all around the inside of the magnet and on the rear of the motor there. And then on the inside plate, the old grease that had gone hard was cleaned off. And all the axle holes were cleaned as well, just to make sure that this model is going to get every chance of returning back to surface, because it is important on these that the axle holes are clean, as they rely on the pickups from the wheels. The base keeper plate was also given a clean up. This had a bit of congealed oil and grease on it, so everything was cleaned up as best I could. I was conscious not to remove any of that weathering. And then the front wheels, well, these were quite dirty. They had a lot of carbon build up on them from the track, so that was scraped off initially with a cocktail stick, and then the front two bogie wheels were then polished up with a cotton bud and meths again. Just it's worth doing, because if you don't, all you're going to do is transfer this muck back onto your layout after you've cleaned the rails. So once all both front bogie wheels were cleaned, I put them back into their bogie frame. They just clip in place. And now we'll start having a look at rebuilding the model. Now, I do make an error here, but I'll see if you can see it, and I'll point it out in a minute. I put the two plastic spacers in and make sure they align up correctly with the holes in the die casting of the chassis. Now that everything's been cleaned up, just use a screwdriver to manipulate them in place. And then I replace the screws we took out earlier on. The three black screws that go into the plastic insulators in each half of the chassis, and that silver screw that goes into the motor housing at the top right hand corner there. So once the two halves of the chassis have been screwed together, I am going to use my pin dropper and put a very tiny amount of oil on that bearing where the armature sits, because that will need lubricating, and then the armature goes back in and is actually pulled in place with the magnetic force of the magnet. Another tiny bit of oil on the bearing on the motor faceplate. Sometimes these pin droppers are good, and other times, like now, it takes ages to get any oil on, and it can be a case of you either get loads or none at all. They are not exactly the best thing to work with, but I'll use it while I've still got oil in it. And there's a small amount of oil, as I said, on that bearing, and then the motor faceplate is put back on where it should be. And then I get the screws there and the brush retainers, and I go to put these in and then realise that I need to take them out because they actually hold the brush retainers in. So what I'm doing here is I'm just ever so gently pulling the springs out slightly, because they were very, very compressed, and this is why I think the motor wasn't running. There wasn't current actually getting to the brushes. So now I've stretched that spring out a bit. I use one of the brush retaining pieces, put that over the top, hold it in place with my left forefinger, and then reapply the screw. And this is where having a magnetic screwdriver really does come in handy. Screw that down in position and repeat for the left hand brush. Now, if you hadn't noticed a mistake, I've had to strip the model back again because I forgot to put the gears in. So, adding a small bit of Lebel 106 grease to the spindles, and it only takes a very tiny amount of this grease. This is very, very good stuff. Goes a long way. I'm also going to put some on the worm gear there. And then the drive cogs, when I can eventually get it in the right way round. The drive cogs are then put back on where they should be. And once they're seated correctly, I'm going to put a very small amount of oil on there as well, just to make sure that everything is properly lubricated, as plastic gears on plastic parts do need some sort of lubrication, as they will wear themselves out over time. And now I can reassemble again the two halves of the chassis and refit the screws again. So now that the chassis is back together, I'm going to just clean up all these axles and wheels on the drive unit. These axles need to be clean. These transmit the power from the track to the chassis. They don't sit in any sort of bearings, they just transfer the power directly from those wheels to the die-cast chassis. And then when I go to put the wheels back, again that centre axle was extremely stiff to push in. I could have opened the hole out by using a file, but I didn't want to. I knew it did run as it was. It's just a bit of a faff getting that wheel in there, but it does clip back in place eventually. And then making sure that all the side rods, etc., as they should be. There's a bit of fluff on it there, so I'm going to just dust that off with an old paintbrush. So making sure that everything is seated correctly and none of the wheels are twisted or the quarterings out. You replace these hanger pieces that are plastic, and these are a push fit onto the die-cast chassis. Once they're in place, I can then put the cylinders back on by gently putting the piston rod and slide bars and manipulating them on the side rods like so. And then these just push back onto their die-cast pins. There's no need for any sort of adhesive. They are a very good friction fit, and once they're in place, they're not going to be moving anywhere. So I just gently line it up like so, and then just finger pressure, just push that cylinder casting on. And the same was repeated for this side. This cylinder casting here was put on after I dusted off the fluff and that was on it. Just simply put the piston rod and slide bars in place like so. I'm just getting it lined up there, and as I say, they are a very good push fit. Now that the cylinders and wheels are back in place, I'm going to replace the base keeper plate, but I'm just going to put a tiny amount of 106 grease on the drive there, and I'm also going to put a small amount of Pico Electrolube on the axles to lubricate them and aid in electrical contact. And then the base keeper plate is put on, starting at the rear and then just clipping it down in place, and then putting the two screws back in to secure it that we took out earlier on. And the front wheels are also back in. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a battery test. I'm just going to jack it up again on a couple of tubs so that I can see the wheels, see if they move around. And to my surprise, there was nothing again. The motor was still dead. So I began to suspect that the battery may not be giving enough power, so I connect up the controller leads, and as soon as I give a bit more power, off the model runs. And you can see there that it's running lovely, spreading that lubrication through the drivetrain, making sure it's all lubricated, and it is running rather nice. There's no tight spots or anything, so I'm really happy with how this has turned out. And while the wheels are spinning under controller power, I polish the wheel treads up with a fiberglass pencil to clean any of that weathering off that was still on there. And then I polish them up with a cotton bud and methylated spirits just to make sure that the driving wheels are as clean as they can be, and this will aid in good running. You can see how much dirt there is on that cotton bud there. So now doing a quick track test, just applying power, and the chassis now runs really nicely. I will reiterate that earlier on I did a battery test and tested it with a controller, and neither of them would power this model. So it was a case of probably built up dirt and compressed springs. The tender on the model, this was in good condition, and apart from giving it a dust over and cleaning all of the wheels on it, as there was quite a lot of carbon build up on the wheels, there was very little really to do to the tender. But it was imperative that I clean the wheels, as like I've said previously, it will just transfer the muck back onto your layout. So now that the model is all back together, the two retaining screws are replaced for the body shell. I managed to find a replacement safety valve that was missing in my spares box. So using a very small amount of super glue from Loctite, I just pushed that into place and let the Loctite do its stuff. And I'm going to tone that down and try and match it in with the weathered one to its left hand side there. And now it's time to refit these sandboxes. So I apply a little bit of Loctite super glue to the lug on the chassis, manipulate the sandpipe round through the side rods, and then push it down in place with finger pressure, and then set it aside and make sure that the glue dries thoroughly. Both of the sandboxes from both sides had come off this model, so it was important that I got them on the correct way round. The sandpipe should face towards the front of the Loco. So now that's been given time to dry, you'll notice that on the wheels and on the side rods there's a lot of the weathering has chipped off and it looks a bit odd. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix some frame dirt and weathered black together, and I'm just going to go around and I'm just going to touch in all of the scratched parts on the side rods and the wheel rims. Now some may argue that it's not going to match the existing weathering, but that doesn't matter as these steam locos very rarely matched in weathering. Weathering comes in all sorts of different varieties, and I'd rather have a little bit of a mishmash in weathering on the wheels rather than have those blaringly obvious silver scratches all over the wheels and the side rods. So using a battery, I just turn the wheels slightly so that I can get to all the crevices to make sure that nothing is missed out. And the weathering on this model really has brought out the detail in it. As I said previously, mainline models were really good for their time, and they do stand up well now. A lot of people will shy away from mainline because of the split chassis and the axle problems, but you can get spares for the axles, and a well serviced, well maintained split chassis model will provide years of very good reliable running. I have several DCC fitted examples in my fleet, and I've got no intention of replacing them anytime soon. So I'm still going with the weathering, just varying the tones between black and brown, just making sure that everything that is silver and standing out is touched up. Just using a 00 brush here. And I hope you'll agree that, as you can see in the footage, and I kept all the footage in because I know a lot of people do like watching people paint. But as you can see, the weathering by touching it in does look rather nice, and it doesn't stand out as being too obviously touched up with a paintbrush. And it is important you keep turning the wheels there when you do this sort of thing so that you don't miss any of the weathering. The only other thing I'm going to do weathering wise on this model is the chassis has got a blanket colour of browns and blacks, and I'm going to pick out the brake blocks in a slightly lighter orangey colour very shortly, just to simulate a bit of brake dust and the iron colour that the brake blocks actually went on these sort of locos. So using a very small amount of this orangey colour, just touching in the brake blocks there, just to give it a bit of variety and make it stand out a little bit more. And as you can see on the top of the model, I'd created a black wash just to tone that safety valve down and blend it in with the one that had been weathered. So it doesn't stand out at all now. So there we go. That is, I'm just removing some excess paint off the wheel treads there. So that is mix Royal Scot virtually done and ready for service. There's that touched in safety valve, and I've just given the wheels another clean to make sure none of the paint was on the wheel treads on the model. But like I was saying, you can see the detail on this model. I'm just going to give it a final dust over, just to remove any loose dust and fragments that are still on the body shell. And there's even cab detail in this model. Now I could have gone to town and picked that out, but I didn't want to go too far, as Mick hadn't instructed me to do anything with the weathering. He just wanted me to repair it. So I didn't want to go too far and start painting the cab interior, etc. But as I was saying, you'd be hard pressed to say that this isn't a good looking detailed model for its age. Alright, it hasn't got sprung buffers, but that's not a be all and end all for me. This really is a handsome looking model, and the weathering job really does set it off. So I'm going to take it to Trains for Use test layout to give it a spin, as it's DC only, not DCC fitted. I'm just showing the riveting detail and that on the tender there. And I do honestly think that for a mainline model, this really is quite a nice looking thing. And now that we've, although I've missed a bit of weathering there, look, on that crank pin, so I'm going to have to get the paint out again just to touch that in. But yeah, I'm just showing you all around the model basically, just so you can see the detail that's put into these older mainline models. So as I was saying, I took it over to Trains for Use test layout, and Nick had a spin on there, and I was happy to see that it was running really nicely. If you've got a Loco you'd like to see featured in a future episode of Trash to Track, please email me at dansmodelrailways@gmail.com. I'll have a look at getting it sent over, and who knows, it may even feature in an episode all of its own. I'm going to get this packed up and sent back off to Mick now. Next episode will be the 100th episode of Trash to Track, so get those questions or anything you want to ask me in the comments below, and I'll address those in a live stream that we'll do probably sometime next week. Thank you so much for watching Trash to Track again. Please like, share and subscribe, and I will catch you all in the next video, which will be the 100th episode of Trash to Track. Bye for now. Yeah.